guess, Andrew.
Yeah, let's kick things off. Hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining this, and to those who are watching the replay, hello to you. This is, of course, the Emerging Market Investors Alliance Extractive Industries program, and we have a series of webinars that we do through this group. Today we're launching kind of a new series with Rémi Piet, I'm very happy to say, and looking forward to some interesting topics we're covering today, as well as in future events we're doing in this coffee chat series, meant to be really a discussion. And maybe just to say, for anyone who's unaware of the Alliance, we're an NGO that brings together investors, companies, policy experts, like those we have here today, to educate, also to facilitate engagement with companies and governments on a range of sustainability and ESG issues. I, Andrew Howell, running the Extractives program. So we touch on a range of topics in this program, relevant to responsible mining, energy production, we're looking at a series of monthly webinars on this topic. For those of you who don't know Rémi, he's I think he's proved to us he's quite knowledgeable person and connected in the extractive sector. I've been enjoying his really quite highly informative webinars, also branded Coffee Chat, over the past several months when he was at AMI. We're very happy to launch this collaboration now, and it's very impressive pedigree that you can see on our website. It includes working on projects all around the world, teaching universities, co-authoring books, etc. So a very good person to have here. So one of the topics which we look at very regularly in this program and extractive industries is, of course, the topic of community and the issues that come up when mining and energy companies run up against potential conflict with communities. We've actually written a brief on this recently, which I hope you all have a look at. And I'm very excited to delve into this topic with some experts, both from the practical side, working on the ground in Latin America on these issues, as well as from the academic side. Very, I think, interesting and useful frameworks here from my colleagues. And I'm going to let Rémi introduce both the topic and our guests and kick things off. Feel free to raise your hand or ask questions into the queue if you have any, and we will just take things from there. So over to you, Rémi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. And you started by flattering my ego. You know that works with a French guy. Congratulations. But you can ask me anything for next week. I'll have to say yes in the future, I guess. More seriously, indeed, that's a topic which is, I think, fundamental to address the issue of community consent. We've seen this over the last few, let's say, years or decade, the rise of above the ground risks to the incapacity of projects to move forward, issues of social license to operate, sustainability, value creation, all these are at play into this question of community consent to extractive industries project. I thought when you actually look at this topic, it's very important to both have the academic backing and research that we definitely have here with our friend from Columbia University, so Tehtena and Leila, that have done a wonderful job and a publication. I think it took like maybe more than a year and a half. I think the first conversation I had with you, Leila, was like maybe 2 years ago on this, which is a very unique angle on community consent, because it brings, also elements of political science, power, interest into the equation. And I thought it was very interesting to also have Guillen on board. I've known Guillen also for many years. Guillen is working for Insuco, a company that does a lot of operations on the ground, especially in Western Africa, in the Andean regions, also in Latin America, Ecuador, Colombia mainly, of working with communities and developing a series of activities and processes to engaging with communities and understanding how to build together. And we've seen this move into the question of community consent, which is, much more geared towards, bottom-up approach, understanding community, not only from the sociological, anthropological element, which is important, but also from a legal, political, economy element, and building value to create this consent from communities to projects. this is the one way to go. If you don't, you actually tend to have to pay much more in the future on issues of security or social license to operate because you have not engaged from the get-go. And I think in this conversation and this exchange, and obviously for people now online, but also people that will listen to this in recorded, we are all available obviously to ask questions. Please ask questions also into the chat box. I will bring that to the attention of the panelists. But I'd like maybe to set the stage, to turn first to Leila, and maybe Leila, if you can actually present to us. I don't know if Andrew is showing some of the slides, but if you can actually present to us a little bit the work that you've done as part of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment that we all know, and how this specific, let's say, approach that you have in the recent publication on community consent, how you bring new lights to this and a different approach to it.
Great, thank you so much, Rémi, and thank you, Andrew, for having us join you today. Rémi, as you mentioned, we've just wrapped up about 1.5 years of research on looking at the application of the principle of free, prior, and informed consent in Latin America, and specifically, we were looking at cases in Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. While trying to be mindful of the broader region, we focus on extractive industry projects. We were coming at this at a lens of appreciating that these prior consultation processes do not seem to be working for Indigenous and local communities who increasingly regard them as sort of these sham box ticking exercises. And it was striking at the time that none of our country experts and our local researchers could provide an example of an FPIC or prior consultation process in the extractives that Indigenous people regarded as successful. They consistently fell far, far short of this standard of seeking free, prior, and informed consent. So we wanted to think about, there's been a significant amount of attention devoted to the capacity issues around consultation processes and whether or not people have access to the information and expertise they need to make these processes meaningful. But we wanted to take on the political economy issue, which is something that we're tackling across an array of topics in extractives governance. And to ask, why are these processes generally working so poorly? What is it about the powerful actors involved and their interests that may or may not be shaping outcomes in a particular way? So our findings are in a way very intuitive, that those with the most power to shape these processes generally don't feel they have a strong interest in seeing them work better. The host governments, particularly the investment promotion agencies, alongside company operations and legal teams, seem to be generally fairly short-sighted about this. They're the actors who are the most responsible for influencing these processes, and they see them as processes that should be moved through as quickly and painlessly as possible, which means generally you get very superficial consultations that often are taking place after key decisions have been made. In this way, we see that, it's the underlying power imbalances that mean that these processes are not actually geared towards meaningful engagement, but are geared towards achieving this reputational benefit of having carried out some sort of consultation without effectively engaging communities. And in that way, it feels like a lot of prior consultation processes are basically ineffective by design. So why should this matter to companies? I just got 2 more quick points. One is because obviously this can create a lot of mistrust from the outset with communities, irrespective of the type of project. Moreover, this current approach to prior consultation basically takes the peaceful channel for community engagement off the table and means that indigenous peoples and other communities basically have no other recourse but to resort to social disruption and conflict because there's no kind of meaningful other pathway available to them. And this is costly, and this has the potential to be very costly. As the Dakota Access Pipeline alone shows, the cost to the companies and partners involved in that were estimated to be about $7.5 billion. And basically, this is the time value for money means that companies and investors tend to be alongside, and I would say this is generalizing because this isn't all of them, but many of them, alongside governments, seem to be most interested in fast tracking at the beginning of a project without fully appreciating that the short-term gains up front in terms of moving quickly and painlessly through a superficial consultation process are often secured at the expense of delays and major operational costs later on. So, having said that, some companies have recognized that there is an interest in building mutually beneficial relationships for a long-term social license and to avoid social conflict and all of its implications. But nonetheless, generally, they tend to still fall short of driving better community consultation processes and well short of requiring community consent as a prerequisite. Now, Rémi,
now I can ask you
I will stop
my
talking.
burning questions. No, please. I mean, no, and I appreciate that you actually made the economic point. I mean, because a lot of the discussion that we have on community consent, it's about also trying to provide the value for both investors and company to understand that, investing, ahead of the curve on those issues is actually an extremely savvy, business decision, because then it obviously limits a lot the kind of expenses and processes that you have to carry out throughout the life cycle of mining project. But I'd like maybe to ask you a question. So it was interesting to read the perception also from different communities, the fact that some of them, start seeing the process as a sham box ticking exercise, that, mining companies arrive, create a lot of momentum, get their potential support to the project until they have the IA approved and licensed to operate. And then obviously they've seen into the experience that, the constants of the effort is often not there, and they just don't abide anymore to those processes. I mean, that's what I've got through your publication also. Maybe you can expand on this. And before I turn to Tehtena also for some more questions.
Sure. I mean, I think that I'm glad you mentioned the EIA processes. There's a kind of direct parallel set of challenges that run through these, which is, you have a kind of large song and dance around the existence of these processes, but they lead to very little in reality. And I think that we have now seen the cycles of these kind of sham consultations play out enough times that communities are learning. Communities and Indigenous people are learning that by participating, they can be sort of co-opted into the sham, and are now, increasingly opting to withdraw or not participate in these processes because they feel there's very little to be gained through their participation. And until they're offered a better alternative, it seems to me that they're going to continue learning that same lesson over and over. And I think that, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, or a dozen times, shame on me. And I think that those lessons are being learned.
And actually, when you actually talk about, lessons being learned, and we will go later with Guillen specifically looking at how to create and continue having this interaction with a series of underground operations and initiatives. But maybe Tehtena, when you look at best case practices and what are the questions to keep in mind when you actually address this question of community consent, when you try to move beyond the mere, just let's say, risk analysis to try to engage with those communities, what are the key questions that should be part of the process? And maybe share some good practices. Obviously, our listeners would love to know how it works.
Sure. So in many countries, it's the duty of government to conduct consultation processes, but for the reasons discussed, it's very much in the company's interest. To use their relative influence to make sure that these processes are carried out in a meaningful way. In some countries, companies are directly involved in the process, although it is the government's duty to conduct the processes. So in terms of good practice, I would say kind of as a foundational good practice, making and accepting that consent rather than mere consultation is the standard. So forcing consent or ignoring a community's decision to withhold consent risks triggering opposition down the road. which may lead to material risks for businesses, including reputational harm, financial losses, potential legal liabilities. So accepting consent as a standard would be kind of a foundational, the foundation of a robust risk avoidance strategy for companies. And then in terms of some questions to ask, so one question that investors might ask companies, what are the community's views of a proposed project, and how have those views influenced the company's plans? So this is important because to understand whether a community's vision and concerns are being heard and are actively addressed, the company should be able to demonstrate that they know what those views are and that they've somehow influenced their plans. Who is being consulted is another key question. Are consultations inclusive of different segments of the community, including the most marginalized? This is really important because if consultations are only being carried out with the most powerful in communities, those views that are being expressed might not necessarily represent the broader community's views. Another key question, how is the community being consulted? Are they being conducted in accordance with the community's own rules for engagement? So for example, some indigenous peoples have developed autonomous protocols which set out the rules and their own kind of customary practices for engaging with third parties. And companies and investors should directly or indirectly push for consultation processes that engage local communities on their own terms, rather than forcing these kind of processes that are designed in accordance with the government or company's own interests in mind. Another key question,
sorry, if I could just jump in. I'm curious about all of these are great questions, and it's actually really helpful to hear these. But I'm just wondering, they sound quite hard to answer in a way, in a concrete way. If investor says, what does the community think about this project? Asking the company, it's quite easy for them to say, well, they say that they're okay with it. But is there a framework for them communicating in a very specific way? This is probably will be a question for Guillen as well, as to what they think, in a way that's actually verifiable and is also kind of concrete. Do you know of any frameworks along those lines?
Yeah, it's a good question because, consultations and consent processes are not kind of a one-off exercise, and they should be kind of ongoing throughout the life cycle of the project. So in order to kind of have something concrete, it's not something that can just be kind of agreed upon and that is, you can produce evidence of an agreement at a certain stage, and that will hold for the life cycle of the project. I think that you do see agreements, consultation agreements, being and kind of the agreements at the outset being concretized in documents, and to the extent that they reflect what has been discussed and what has been agreed on, that could be at one point in the process some kind of evidence of the outcomes of a consultation process. But of course, that would need to be updated and continue on through the life cycle of the project to be able to kind of stress test the level of community consent and agreement and views to the project.
And we follow up, if we follow up on case of base case practices and others. I mean, obviously we discuss a little bit academically of a topic, mentioning, let's say structures, questions to ask, but we have to keep in mind that we're talking about communities, we're talking about human beings, we're talking about relationship between human beings, from a mining company to a political institution that could be a town hall or a municipality. Sorry, I was looking for my words. And also the communities. So the whole element here is an element of trust and question of whether or not the dialogue is possible and how do you facilitate this dialogue, and especially in terms of accountability. I was interested into a specific example in Liberia that you had in your publication about an accountability lab, if I'm not wrong, that looked at the capacity for people to actually believe in the process, to actually buy into it, and therefore be a part of it. And then obviously, Guillen, I probably will follow up on this specific question with you, but that'd be great, Tehtena, if you can give us a little more perspective on this Liberia example, or in any other that is in your publication that looks at this trust element, mediation, accountability element in the process itself.
Yeah, Leila, do you want to take that one on the accountability lab?
Sure. Tehtena passes it to me because she knows that this that the work of the Accountability Lab, it comes up. I sort of mention an example almost on a daily basis. Okay. But this project in Liberia, they set up this basically working as a sort of neutral third party. They basically were able to assess the information needs of the communities, what they wanted to know about these projects, what information there was in the contracts and the agreements that affected, you know, their day-to-day lives, and to have this translated into not only local dialects, but also a lot of radio content, to make this sort of readily available, and then to convene discussions on the basis of that between the communities and the companies themselves. I think sometimes it can be tricky when this is a private sector led undertaking without a kind of third-party neutral actor performing this function. But I think that because it combined the third-party element as well as an information provision function, so that that everyone involved was coming to the table feeling like they knew what they wanted to know. And as you say, Rémi, just kind of trusted that information and trusted the general spirit of the undertaking, that they could participate more effectively. And, you know, they will give you all the caveats, but it did appear that for the period of about a year or 18 months or however long it was after these interventions, that they tracked community conflict between the mine and the community, there had been a significant drop, like over 75% in conflict, which suggests that, you know, that this model has some potential. They were called citizen help desks. I think they're now called civic action teams, but I think that there's something there to this kind of third-party role in both filling information gaps and able to communicate both the information gaps, filling the information gaps for the communities, but also being able to communicate to the companies, to articulate what were the issues that particular community cared most about. I think it is really valuable for both sides.
And I agree. That's why I love to get maybe Guillen's perspective on this. I mean, I've worked with Guillen in different countries, and I've seen the impact of, you know, communities that did not trust any kind of process, and then moving towards, you know, understanding it, being part of it. How do you actually manage to push forward with a series of, you know, roundtables, absolutely, public hearings and other in consultation? Can you maybe, Guillen, explain us how you're able to bring more trust in the conversations and move forward steadily, incrementally towards working together towards value creation in the mining territory, please?
Yeah, thanks, Rémi, and thanks, Andrew, for this nice invitation to share some insights and some learnings. Obviously, there is no one single solution and one single answer to a such complex question, but I think part of that relies on what Leila and Tehtena just told us, on the fact that when we are talking about prior consent and prior consultation, when we are talking about public participation, sometimes we just look all these scenarios as standalone scenarios, and we forgot that basically they are always part of a more diverse, adaptive, and continuous engagement process. And that means that you need to adapt your strategies to the different spaces and to the different scenarios, because stakeholders might not be only the same in the different scenarios, but you need to have a clear idea from the top of the company to all the different areas of the company. It's not only a social issue, it's not only a social management issue, it's a community relations issue, to have a clear understanding of this fact of building trust. It takes some time, so it's not a project, it's not an initiative, it's a process. And that's something that sometimes frighten the companies and some maybe public stakeholders, because for the KPIs, it's maybe more effective to have, you open this roundtable, you close this roundtable when the conflict is finished. And actually you will see in the whole region and where we work that every territory is different, every community is different, and obviously you need to adapt all your dialogue architecture to the specificities of this territory. But you need to maintain always, I think, sort of a short and long-term perspective in your engagement. And there was a very interesting study that I will share to you all, and I recommend, that was made by 2 institutions, one in Peru, which is GRADE, and one in Chile, which is Espacio Público, financed by the Ford Foundation. They just issued the results a few months ago. And it's a study on rethinking the formal participation scenarios and rethinking them in the context of EIA. And it was interesting that Leila mentioned this link between maybe prior consultation and formal participation spaces, because one of the learnings of this study is that most of the time, it's not always, but most of the time, because we are thinking of very rigid, very fixed, very few adaptive architecture mechanism, these public participation processes tends to increase conflicts and not diminish conflicts, because questions of gaps in access of information, power, the fact of having a standalone process that is not linked to a permanent engagement strategies that makes a lot of pressure on one single process. And also something which I think is key is when you want to engage in this type of process, you need to make sure that you will move from one perspective where you have the company engaging relations with local stakeholders. You need to move from that vision to a vision where you will have the territory at the center. I mean, the place where you're developing the project, and really find the ways of having a collaborative ways of working. And when Leila was talking about how do you define meaningful engagement process, I think part of the criteria you need to understand is that to be meaningful, that means that it's not meaningful only for the company or meaningful only for the community, it's meaningful for the territory. And to have this vision, which is more integrated, that means that meaningful leads to collective action processes. And to have collective action processes, that means that you need to match different criteria. I mentioned the long-term vision. There is others. You need to think about leaderships at the local level. It's not an issue only of company and communities. What type of leadership do we have? Most of the spaces where we work are spaces more oriented towards resolving some conflicts than building something together. And it's not just saying it that you will do it. It's really building a whole architecture, and maybe the fact of having third-party actors, it can be key on this type of process. But issues like, for example, the metrics, in a big project, you're always measuring everything in terms of everything, basically, but you're never measuring the quality, the effectiveness of your engagement strategies. You're not necessarily learning by doing, because you know that you will have some mistakes, you will need to adapt always your dialogue structure. So I think one of the main recommendation is to say that dialogue and engagement is a really, I mean, it matters, and it's to make it well, you need to invest. But basically, if you don't invest, it will cost you more than if you're just seeing every space as a standalone space and not as an integrated engagement process. And I think that's part of the solution and part of the problem.
And I think when we talk about, integrated solution or process, I think comes up first of all to the question when we talk about community consent is who are we talking about and who should actually be included in the process. When you have specific projects, initiatives that are just looking at individual indigenous communities, for example, or are just looking at a very narrow idea of what is the area of influence of a project, you tend to just take care of a problem with a small band-aid, but not actually addressing it in full. I know in terms of the roundtables that you've conducted in different countries, you engage also with private sector, you engage also with local municipality, you engage with different actors of understanding how they all have a role into the say of development of that territory and inclusion and integration of, let's say, an elephant in a China shop sometimes when it comes to a mining company arriving in an area which has never seen such level of investment and structuration. How do you actually engage with different actors and how do you bring them all together around the table?
Well, that's a tricky question. The thing is that first thing is you need to understand the territory, I think, and the local context. That's obvious to say it, but when you are in a EIA, when you are in a due diligence, what you think is, okay, how I will understand the influence area. And actually, you are never in an influence area. You're always in a territory based on social relations, on complex social relations between a diversity of stakeholders. And if you maintain a narrow vision of what's your influence area, you will always have stakeholders that should be part of this discussion and are not part. So I think the first thing, and we have some companies that are investing before in social baselines, before having any requirement of EIA, because they need to understand the territories, they need to understand who are the main stakeholders in the territory before launching even a prior consultation process. And I think that's key. The second thing is to take the time to understand this relation between stakeholders at the local level. And third, you need to be transparent in every of the steps that you will manage, because most of the time our roundtable processes are fully open. That means that we are not selecting who have the possibility to enter in these spaces or who has enough legitimacy to say something, because we think that the issues, the priorities, the institutions will find a way to manage themselves to bring relevant stakeholders at this table, at the condition of having, again, an adaptive and continuous engagement process. If you have a one-shot process, it's sure it won't be representative, because it can never be representative as such. So I think that's a big thing, and the need to be flexible also. I think we have very long-term dialogue processes that work very well, and then you have to manage a conflict and you need to adapt your strategies. And that's our day-to-day. I mean, we don't have the success story that works everywhere. No, the thing is, what is key, I think, is to be really multi-stakeholder from the beginning and make sure that the company is not at the center. The company needs to be one key stakeholder in the table. Obviously, most of the time it's the more powerful stakeholder, but the fact of having it not at the center, but as part of the stakeholder, I think it's key. And the value also of commitment, I think that's something key, in the sense that to respect the commitments, to make transparent commitments, to make measurable commitments, not only from the company side, because most of the time the issues are more from public authorities, other stakeholders that not necessarily fulfill their commitments. So that's why I always insist on the fact that the dialogue stage, it's only a stage, but if you want to deal with a process, you need a lot of management between every spaces of dialogue. You need to make sure, if you want to build the legitimacy of this engagement process, that stakeholders fulfill their commitments. And once the company do that, when the public authorities receive enough, sometimes pressure to commit themselves, when the community is not only on trying to build a list of needs, and actually we always try to avoid the word of having sort of this need-based approach. We always think that in dialogue process, you need to think of joint priorities and joint objectives. If you start to build dialogue based on needs, you will never finish, because needs are always longer than priorities. Building on priorities with relevant stakeholders, being transparent, being open to a diversity of participants, and being very strict with the following on commitments, I think are key elements to make sure you have an interesting and inclusive dialogue participation process.
Hey, Guillen, if I may, Rémi, I would love to ask a question here, which is, when you're talking about priorities and then commitments, how often in your experience are these really economic in nature? Is there usually or often, ultimately it is kind of about money or distribution of resources? Or is that actually not the case? That maybe is a mistake that we make, thinking this is all about just sharing the pot, but differently. No, in fact, it may be about other things. You talk about trust, about respect, about institutions and things like that, instead of just purely being a monetary solution.
Well, I think it's always a mixed bag. I think that's why I was sharing this idea of having a clear long-term objective, because if you don't have a clear long-term objective, you will always fall into transactional ways of solving issues. And the easiest way to solve transactional approaches or issues with monetary concerns that can be local content, obviously employment and opportunities for local development that are key. Actually, you won't have a successful dialogue process without a clear strategy of local content. I think that's obvious. The thing is how to deal with that. It's not because we are talking about employment and local business opportunities that the only stakeholder that has important things to say is the company. You have a local ecosystem of institutions that needs to take part of these things. So if you just are in a one-by-one relation talking about employment and local opportunities, it will be monetary at the end of the day. If you open the way of dealing with this dialogue, maybe you will have the opportunity to discuss with other stakeholders. But I'm sure that, for example, in most of our dialogue process, you have also important things about productive diversification, about tourism, about culture, about social issues, because that's part of the territory. And that's why I say it's a mixed bag, because the territory, it's a mixed bag. And then it's a issue that Rémi knows very well, but it's how do you manage to make sure that the priorities that are being addressed in these spaces are the good ones and are the legitimate ones, because actually it can be interesting for me or for the company or for some stakeholders in the territory, but I need to find a way. If I want to be adaptive, I need to find a way of having an ongoing system that lets me to identify new priorities. And most of the time priorities are very broad-based, and so if you are not continuously in the territory, you will miss some important priorities. You will try to give short-term answers to more structural problems of the territories, and that's part, I think, of some of the mistakes we usually do when we try to move these issues.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting when you actually mention also the different interests and priorities. And there's one question that I often had with Columbia universities is, I think it's groundbreaking, is looking at, you know, the issue of how you put the money in terms of objective also for the managerial team. Let me just rephrase that. When you have a roundtable, when you talk about, you know, community consent, you have communities that have a wide range of interest and into the long run, and they don't have trust, okay? But on the side, you also have a mayor or different organization that want to be re-elected in a time frame of 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. And even later, and more important, you also have, you know, managers of mining companies whose basis of remuneration structure is based on the fact that they're going to have the EIA at this specific date, or that the acceptance of the project is going to be increased by, let's say, 15-20% in that very specific city. And as a result, all the projects or all the initiatives from the project itself are geared towards the satisfaction of short-term objective that answers the needs and interest of 1 or 2 people in power into that process. Maybe Tehtena, if I can turn to you on this, what are your suggestions on this? I know it's something that is brushed upon into your report, and that a lot of people don't look specifically into it, but that is essential to the success of the process itself, when you have the personal interest also included into this framework.
For sure, and thanks for bringing that up, because I think that was one of the really interesting parts that came out of the research, where we tried to kind of disaggregate within the company, you know, at the project level, all of the different interests of the different actors and how they interact. And as you say, you know, the most powerful actors within companies at the project level tend to be driven by these kind of high stakes personal interests and keeping the, you know, the project on time, on budget, etc., without building in the flexibility needed for meaningful prior consultation processes. We heard in the interviews that oftentimes it's only the project managers who have had personal experience of things going wrong when they didn't get the community engagement piece right. That is, in this one interviewee's experience, that is kind of the defining factor as to whether those personal incentives and interests were kind of tempered by the kind of longer term interests in building social license. In terms of suggestions, I mean, it's a really tricky one, because I think that it takes kind of a change in mindset, but also a change in those incentive structures. And this is one piece that we want to dig in more to and kind of follow on research and trying to understand kind of where there is scope for better aligning incentive structures, personal kind of remuneration packages with social performance. One interviewee we spoke to said, kind of echoing Guillen's message about kind of not measuring social engagement and how these processes are going. One interview we heard from mentioned the need for kind of some kind of metric system, some way of being able to link a measure of social performance to then be able to reorient incentive schemes. Yeah, I'll pause there.
On these, by the way, just more specifically, I know Joseph Stiglitz, also from Colombia, so I'm almost next door from you right now. I actually did a lot of work on climate change inclusion on sovereign wealth fund structures. So how do you get managers from sovereign wealth funds include climate change mitigation adaptation as part of their objective? It's still this ongoing element of how to make sure that every single personal, or let's say, you know, more general interest are actually included into the roundtable for discussion. That might be actually a specific question for Guillen, because if you don't acknowledge those particular interest, that might be an economic interest, a political interest, or something, into the framing of your roundtables, then obviously you do have people that don't fully abide by them, or have a specific idea in mind to try to gear the process out of the legitimate process of inclusion of the project. How do you account for this, Guillen? Maybe if I can turn to you again in terms of the actual roundtable. I know you've done a series of you know, conflict resolution roundtables. You've done a series of trying to see maybe how to diversify economies, even in mining territories, so that you had mining companies support diversification of projects and in economic development in their vicinity. How do you actually abide by those and include those specific interests when you actually address people on round tables? And your team, by the way, not only you, obviously.
Yeah, no, I mean, you need to, you cannot avoid to have individual interests, and sometimes this individual interest can be economical one, can be political one in function of the context. I think the key there is really the work of the facilitators, of the mediators of this dialogue process. And I think that there is very interesting new initiatives. There is one of Erasmus Plus project between Europe and Latin America to develop capacities of local facilitators in rural territories to address conflicts, but also to move towards more collective action processes. And I think that's part of the, I don't know if the word is solution, but it's part of the process, is to have really committed facilitators that can be third parties, that can be people from the community, but that can be trained to understand what's the difference between an individual interest, a particular interest that you will need to address and you will need to deal, but basically what you will need to do is to channel this type of individual interests in more collective ones. And basically our experience is that people that only look for an individual interest, they won't be part on a long-term basis of your long-term dialogue strategy. So you need to have, because they won't receive a direct answer to a single individual concern. And so that's the tricky part, because you need to make your best effort to channel these needs and priorities to more collective ones. But you need to monitor and you need to have enough metrics to make sure that when you have stakeholders that jump out the process because they feel that their individual needs didn't get addressed on this process, you need to have alternate strategies to make sure you're not just letting these individual interests only alone in the ground. So, and that's part of I mean, the ability of the facilitators to read the complexity of these spaces and to channel these interests.
I think Leila had a specific question that she wanted to ask. I'm just like pointing fingers at you, like very rude right there. But please feel free. I mean, this is an open open space.
So I wanted to pick up an issue that we have come across a lot in our interviews with companies, which is this feeling of great frustration when they feel that, for instance, they would like better consultation processes. A specific example was given to us by a company who had asked that a wider group of community participants be included in a consultation, and the government said, no, we're allowing these three because those were the three that had been more or less co-opted into the government's agenda. And I think that we've been hearing about this feeling of frustration because at the end of the day, when there's a bad social or economic outcome, it's the company that then becomes the target of a lot of those bad feelings. And so I'm wondering if you think there are any ways that investors and companies who do feel that they have an interest in seeing these processes go better can drive governments in that direction, because ultimately those governments are saying we are serving your interest. And maybe they're understanding where those interests currently lie. And I just wonder if there's a way to recalibrate a little around that, and for investors and governments to use their position of power, but also the interests they have, the interests the governments have in serving them to help move these processes in a more positive direction.
I mean, maybe if I give the first dig at this, and please afterwards just we can use that as a question to try to wrap this up. I think I mean, first of all, when we talk about government, there's all the issue of national governments, local government now, but I don't want to dig into this. I think what's essential is to understand, what you're trying to achieve with a community consent process or consulta previa or others. We've seen, especially in Ecuador, we've seen in Colombia also, this issue that, those processes sometimes are short-lived or actually lead to much more frustration, because you opened up the opportunity for dialogue, for conversation. Everybody arrives and wants to talk about his thing. And as good as, the work that Guillen does can be over a few weeks to try to unleash discussion and create some value and comprehensive value between different actors, what's missing is a constant dialogue, basically. I mean, there are a series of tools. I mean, there are platforms that allow for, social media platform limited into a specific geography that allow for people to talk about whatever they want to talk about, even if it's not really part of the process. You want to be able to unleash and get all of this, first communication and reaction from the community before being able to actually go to the real center of the issue and what's important to them. One of the problems that I see here is that, first of all, from the government level, a lot of those consulta previa or prior consultation are not well defined legally and others. And so therefore, mining companies or energy companies are trying to navigate into a legal surrounding that they don't even know if this actually going to be able to be applied to their projects. So they're kind of on the side of it, or they just let the government take care of it, knowing of the problem that you will have sometimes with the national government, which is hated in a province, for example. There's a lot of rivalries there. I think the key for me is really to just open up dialogue on a constant basis, having those roundtables, having the consulta previa as key moment of an ongoing process that doesn't have to be full and developed by either national entities and government or mining companies, because they have a bias. People sometimes don't want to talk to them. But there should be platforms where people integrate their desires, their needs, their dreams, and allow for understanding what is the objective of, Mr. Perez here and Mrs. Conchita there, for example, into developing her own business, into developing and having her kids go to school for a specific education process. But that's, generating this data where you can then build on the efficient roundtables and continue, on a regular basis, building the trust that you have on the daily conversation, on the daily space when you can talk about any issue that you have, not only the ones that have been decided by, let's say, the structure of economic gains, education, social infrastructure, because some of the needs from community members don't fit into those specific pillars, but trying to unleash the conversation with social media platform. I mean, that's my first take, but please, I mean, Tehtena or Andrew or Guillen, please feel free to take a stab at this. Maybe Guillen first, since you're on the daily basis on that.
No, just maybe I'm fully agree with what you just say. Maybe to build on that, I think it's really important also to have the capacity to measure the impacts or the results, the effects of these ongoing dialogue and engagement processes on community well-being. And I think that's important to mobilize public authorities at the national and local level, but also investors. We recently launched a network of territorial transformation observatories, and it's quite interesting to see that once you have this type of project and you have really an ongoing dialogue processes, yeah, you can observe a more effective, positive territorial transformation in terms of community well-being. And I think the lack of data and of metrics is always part of the problem. Once you have enough data without spending a lot of money, I mean, there is a lot of existing data that is on there, but you don't process it, and so you don't have the information. Once you have there, you build a sort of different types of engagement strategies with stakeholders like governments or investors. And I think that's part of the thing. Is not, it's why I started like that. You're not only on a round table and you're not all after doing social investments. I mean, you are in a territory and you need to understand both things and how the territory is being transformed by this project to anticipate negative transformation and to push for more positive ones and to know how to communicate them.
Could I, Guillen, just ask a follow-up to that, because your data has come up a few times, the difficulties with getting quality data to measure how the community engagement process is going. And I'm curious if you can give some examples of best practice you would, what are kind of a handful of the most useful concrete metrics that can be measured for monitoring a community engagement process. And then also to ask, Rémi mentioned social media, and I do wonder also to what degree do kind of the new technological media platforms for social engagement, are those creating new practical tools in the community relation process that you can start using these platforms in some way to do either engagement itself or measurement of that engagement? Any thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, on your first question, thank you, Andrew. There is things around, I think, the quality of your dialogue process and the efficiency of this process, and I think the part on quality is more associated to understanding the barriers for participation. So having some and the representativity of the stakeholders in this type of process. So that's our basic, indicators to know who is participating, are there decision makers or not decision makers, whether they come from, did they come on all your roundtable dialogues, or do they come only when you have specific issues? What are these type of specific issues that are raised in this type of dialogue processes? And then something that we started measuring a few years ago, which is very interesting, is who are the stakeholders that are assuming most of the commitments at the local level. Is it only commitments channeled and addressed by the company, or do you have public authorities assuming their own commitments? Is there commitments that are assumed by different stakeholders, because that's part of a more mature process? And for example, the time between the moment you assume these commitments and it's transformed in a concrete action, that's also part of some interesting indicators to see if your process is more a process geared towards resolving some short-term specific issues addressed in a very short period of time by one single stakeholder, or you are more a diverse type of issues with different stakeholders assuming different commitments and with different times for any specific commitments. So that's part of the indicators, and you have a lot then to see the type of projects that have been addressed through this type of dialogue processes in terms of issues, in terms of thematics, but also who is the main investors in this type of projects. All these type of things gives you an idea of the type of dialogue process that you are built. Is it for more short-term, more long-term? And on your second part of the question, and I will let Rémi build on this because he has great experience. Also, I think we are facing this new digital community engagement era where I think that's not only to face the actual COVID crisis and situation, I think it's really can turn to be an opportunity to create a more inclusive, continuous and effective engagement system. There is a lot of barriers to participation at the local level. There is a lot of problems for communities to access to some digital tools, but actually now it's part of the agenda of a lot of stakeholders at the local level. And what we are seeing is that digital community engagement can be a way also to fostering participation of some communities that didn't have the opportunity to move 1 hour, 2 hours to the places where you are developing these roundtables. It can be an opportunity to have a more diverse also participation. And what our recommendation is, maybe you don't need to build necessarily always new systems, but you need to understand what's the existing social media channels that are existing on territory and build on this with some metrics and analytics that will give you more information. But we are clearly facing this new digital community engagement era, and we need, it's not an issue of all wine and new bottles. It's a question of how does this situation give us an opportunity to innovate and to be even more inclusive in our dialogue processes.
Yeah, maybe just on this, and I'll turn to Tehtena maybe for a little, concluding comments on this. I agree. I mean, the platforms are very interesting. They should not be the solution. They always need to be, full but on the ground work. I mean, a lot of people that think that we're just going to go to a community consent 2.0 with an online platform with no boots on the ground. That's not something which is feasible in a series of different territory, and you need to show presence, obviously. But what's interesting with the platform, obviously, is to be able to catch, some interest or some, let's say, misdevelopment of the territory that would not be voiced on normal, let's say, public hearings, where usually you have the very loud talkers that speak on behalf of 50 people, while in truth, there are actually 50 people that would like to speak, but don't find a way to have their voice listened to on a series of different events. So hand in hand, having platforms, community platforms limited to the territory. It's always interesting to look at what you have on Facebook and Twitter, but that brings a lot of different externalities to the project itself. But being able to measure those data, and then turning back to the publication from CCSI, when you actually look at it from the perspective of interest and power, that's where you see and realize that there's a lot more interest in the community that you had potentially seen. Their power is limited, but you actually have to be able to discuss with them so that they don't just bundle or bandwagon with the loud talkers and create a structured opposition to a project just for political reasons, much more than actually what is dear to you. That might be education of your kids, might be a small entrepreneurship project on for your restaurants or for your ecotourism, for example. There is a lot of ways to be able to gain for the presence of the extractive sector in the territory with knowledge management, with a better and more modern, more structured way of operating a business. Obviously, when you look especially at more remote areas of territories, but then being able to grasp this and turn into the interest of individual citizens that just want to have a better future for their small business, for their family and others. And through social media, that's something which is very interesting because it's a bottom-up approach. People feed that in without being part of an already structured process in which they feel that they have to give the right answer. Like students in the classroom, how do I get an A, for example? The objective is really to be able to open up and democratize the discussion into this. I'll turn maybe to Tehtena on this. When you're looking at interest, when you're looking at the evolution of power, the inclusion of technological tools, especially in a post-COVID-19, I hope it's a post-soon world, what have you seen in terms of those evolution in terms of community consent? And please feel free to just share your concluding thoughts before Andrew probably wrap this webinar. I could speak like this for 10 hours, but I'm pretty sure people listening just want me to just take a little bit of silence.
Thank you, Rémi. Just a concluding thought, just to echo what's been said, that inclusive processes are important, but also really tricky. Understanding the internal dynamics of the community and how to reach those and make sure that more marginalized voices are included in the process is an ongoing challenge throughout the process. And just on measuring community well-being and kind of tools that are out there, one tool that is increasingly being used, and there have been some interesting pilots, has been the Beyond Zero Harm framework, which is essentially a set of indicators, a methodology, a process for developing a baseline and then measuring community well-being over time, not necessarily specifically related to community engagement processes, but the tool could be adapted to be used in that way. But yeah. Thank you so much for having us today. Really enjoyed the conversation.
No, thank you for being part of this panel of conversation. Andrew, if you want to take it from there and maybe wrap this up, I'll be more than happy.
Yeah, that sounds great. We'll just leave the time now to thank you all for a great conversation. I think that gave us a lot of nuanced ideas about the complexity of the issues in this process, but also some very practical specifics. I think that that investors can take away and find very useful in their own engagements with companies on these issues. So really appreciate all of your time. Tehtena, Leila, Guillen, and Rémi, of course, and look forward to having you all back.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Tehtena, Leila, Guillen.
Yes.